happening, guys? It's Dean from Electronisounds. Stick around. Today I'm going to show you how you can create 16-bar drum patterns inside of miRack for iPad. Let's get into this. Before we get started today, be sure and subscribe if you're into this kind of content. On this channel, I talk about everything from modular synthesis with iPads to making tracks on iPads. We talk about old gear, we talk about new gear, we talk about making live jams, we talk about sound design, all that good stuff. Be sure and subscribe. Thanks for joining me today, guys. We're going to go ahead and start by inserting a few more modules. Currently, I've got the clocked module in, I've got a limiter, and I've got a VU meter so we can see our global output level, and that's running into our audio out. The limiter is going to keep everything from going over the 0 decibel limit, and it's going to help protect our speakers, our ears, and our headphones. I highly recommend you use the limiter right as the last thing before your master out in your projects. Since we're working with drums and sequencers today, let's go ahead and start by inserting some drum modules and a sequencer. We're going to go ahead and go to the tags. We're going to click on drum. We're going to go ahead and start with a kick generator. We're going to start with a snare generator, and we're going to start with a closed hat generator. I'm going to just sort of bring these down so that we can get a little bit of a different view on these here. Bring this over. And we're going to need a sequencer to go ahead and start creating a custom pattern for these. So we're going to go ahead and, in our tags section, we're going to go ahead and scroll down to the sequencer section. You get all sorts of options here. For this one, we're going to go ahead and choose the Seek 3x16 today. So we'll go ahead and get that one into our project. We're going to go ahead and assign a clock to this from our clocked module. And we're going to just leave the tempo at 120 for now. And we can see, I'm going to zoom in so you can see that. You can see that the playhead is, the MIDI clock has already started, our playhead moving across. This is like a 16-step sequencer. If you're familiar with like the Roland 808 style of sequencing, this is exactly the same as that. We have 3 lanes, 3 different sequences that we can program into this sequencer, and we can use the trigger output, and we can also use this trigger for this sequencer for melodics. But we're not worried about any melodics today. We're just going to be worrying about the trigger and using this as a really simple XOX style step sequencer. Currently our tempo is going at about like quarter notes on our 120 clock. So I'm going to bring our clock here up to ×4, and now let's see if I can zoom in. I really want to show you guys this. We're getting 16th notes here that's scrolling at 120 BPM. We can change, the BPM up here at the top, but, the BPM will sync to whatever tempo your projects are currently at. I know a lot of people really love modular synthesis for just that, for the synthesis aspect of it and creating unique melodies and whatnot, and I'm completely about that, but I find that, while you're focusing so much on those melodies, often the drums can kind of get left in the background and as an afterthought. And a lot of times I'll end up maybe just grabbing a trigger from a clock module, dropping that into a kick module, creating a 4 on the floor and calling it done, But this is going to provide a way for you guys to actually program patterns that shift and change along with all of those wonderful melodics that we're programming. Now we're going to need a way to hear these drums back, so we're going to go ahead and insert a mixer at this time. We're in the tag section, and I'll click mixer. Which mixer you use is, completely up to you and how you set up your workflow and your sessions. For this tutorial, we're just going to be really, really simple about it. In fact, maybe I'll just grab this and put it down over here. We're going to take it out from the kick. We're going to run that into the first channel here, and out from the snare into the second channel, and we're going to patch that out from the hi-hats into the third input here. I'll go ahead and stop the sequencer at this time, and we're going to take a trigger output from our first lane into the trigger input of the kick. We're going to take a trigger output from our second sequencer lane here and run that into the snare. And we'll take a trigger output from our third sequencer lane and run that into the hi-hats. Now, if you'd like to use more drum modules than this, by all means, just insert another one of these sequencers and you can continue chaining these things together. Now we'll just need to route the mixer into the limiter. So we're going to grab our left channel, and we're going to patch that into the left input on the limiter. We'll grab our right channel, and we're going to patch that into the right input on the limiter. And now if I press play on the sequencer here, and we zoom in a bit on the sequencer, and this is our first row, which is assigned to our kick drum. And let's say for this tutorial that we don't want to do a 4 on the floor pattern. That's kind of the whole point of this, so that you can program your own patterns. You're just going to put dots on each of the, on each of the steps where you would like a trigger to happen and trigger that kick drum. I'm going to go ahead and choose the 909 kick drum today because it's a little bit louder. I think you guys can probably hear that better at home. Let me just verify that I'm not too loud here. Turn that down just a little. Scope out the level on the camera again. And what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and pop in a snare on our... Whoa, it's probably way too loud for you guys at home. Turn that big old snare down. Let's go ahead and switch this snare to a 909 snare today. We'll just work... Actually, that 808 snare was a little bit more punchy. I'm going to scroll through the snares and we'll get back to that 808 for today. Cool, we can bring the volume on that down even a little bit more. And what we'll do is go ahead and move that accidentally down. We'll go ahead and put in some dots here for our hi-hat. Sort of arbitrarily just get a pattern going. Cool. Now, what we've got is we've got a 1-bar drum pattern happening, right? This could be anything, any kind of beat you want, any kind of tempo you want. You don't have to use these drum modules. You could have used, other oscillators to create your drum sounds. So you could have programmed some drum sounds from some different oscillators in here. But what we're going to do now is we're going to work on this sequencer and turn this 1-bar pattern into a 16-bar pattern. Basically, what we need to do is we need to program 16 different variations of this drum part into the sequencer. Now, that sounds a little bit overwhelming at the beginning and maybe like, oh my gosh, this is going to take an awful lot of time. But it really doesn't. What you can do, see, we're going to go ahead and just mute these drums for now so that I can keep the clock running, but also not have super amounts of volume here while we go over this. All we need to do, guys, is click the copy button 16 times on each one of these patterns. And by default, what it does is it copies the existing pattern to the next available pattern slot. You see where there's a CV input here for patterns? This is so you could assign, different other sequencers or maybe even a clock signal to move these patterns and cycle them forward to the next pattern, and it will sync to the downbeat of the next bar. But what we're going to do is we're going to make some variations here, and then we're going to use this global change trigger at the bottom to scroll through these so that at the beginning of each bar, it scrolls to the next available pattern. So what we'll do is we'll just click copy. And now if you look really close here, you'll see that we're actually on the second pattern. It just copies it into the next one. So you can do this pretty quickly. You can just copy this all the way across. Okay. And now we'll do the same thing on the pattern beneath here. We'll make sure that we're in the very first pattern. We're going to click copy, and we're just going to copy this pattern across. Actually, this pattern is empty, so let's fix that. I'm going to go, let's have put the snares inside of a different pattern by mistake. No worries, we'll just turn our volume back on, program a snare part, maybe put a, cool. And then now, let's mute that so that you guys can hear what I'm saying. We're going to zoom back in on this sequencer and just copy this snare pattern over 16 times. Fantastic. And we're going to do the same thing for the hi-hats. We're going to just copy this over. This is where the Apple Pencil really comes in handy, because this is, even if I zoom in all the way, I can do it with my finger, but it's, really handy to use the Apple Pencil with this. And now, I'm going to turn the volume back on, but I'll bring this down a little bit. Sorry, there's no direct sound today. It's more important to get across what I'm actually saying than it is to, you know, hear the actual sounds that we're choosing. The sounds themselves are what you will choose and what will make, you know, your tracks sound like your tracks. But now, if we click on any of these global change patterns down here, on the next bar, it just goes ahead and changes to that pattern. So we literally have 16 patterns. They're all the same at this time. But it's a really easy thing. Let me go ahead and mute that so I don't have to yell so loud, guys. Sorry. Well, it's a really, really easy thing to just select, you know, use your global change and highlight that very last pattern. This is going to be, you know, pattern 16. We can go ahead and just make this into a little bit of a variation. Put the volume back on so we can hear. Maybe we'll put, for the sake of this tutorial, like a snare roll here, by clicking some extra dots, right? And maybe we'll change it by taking off the hi-hat roll there and putting in some other notes, you know? Maybe we'll put in an extra snare, an extra kick, you know, a couple extra kicks, so that it's a different pattern. And then what we can do is we can count backwards or forwards from the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if I click that, this is now measure 8, okay? And I can do the same kind of thing. I can make a turnaround, maybe put some extra kick drums in there. Maybe I could make a variation on the snare there, and maybe we could just put all the hats in for this one. And now our original pattern is still intact, and if we start sending a CV trigger to this global change, it will trigger this to scroll to the next pattern at the beginning of the downbeat of the next bar. Let's go ahead and get that set up so that this scrolls through all 16 patterns. We're going to go ahead and just patch this global change CV here into our next clock, and by default we're going to turn this clock down quite a bit. Let's start with a divided by 8, and we'll see what that does. Our pattern, I'm going to zoom in a lot so you guys can see here. Our patterns are in fact scrolling and changing, but they're scrolling a little bit too slow. I think it's every 2 bars, maybe 2, 2, 3. Yeah. So all we have to do then, I'm guessing, is make this a little bit less. Let's try divided by 4, and that should probably do it. 3, 4, 2. Yep, it's changing on the downbeat of every bar now. So I'm trying to show you this sequencer. It's really hard to see on the camera at home, but you can see here, on the downbeat of each, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Measure 2, 2, 3, 4, 3. Can you see this, you know, dot changing along at home? And what you can do is you can take the time to get in here and, you know, make as much different variation in these as you want. Typically with drums, you might have some variation on the 2nd bar. You might have a little bit more variation on the 4th bar. And you might have a lot of variation, kind of a turnaround, sort of forward momentum change happening on like the 8 and the 16 bars. And you can just go through and take as much or as little time as you want to create some variations in your drums. I'm going to go ahead and stop the clock here, and we'll reset this so that you can hear how it's changing on the 8th measure. We're going to go ahead and stop the clock by hitting run over here on the clock. I'm going to hit this. Actually, we're going to go ahead and assign that now. We're going to take the reset, out of our clock module. We're going to put that into the reset of our sequencer. And now when I hit the reset button over here, it resets our clock to the beginning of the downbeat. And when I hit run, it's measure 2. Whoops, I didn't actually reset the global change to bar 1. So let's do that and zoom in a little bit. Oh, I see, because it's setting, I don't have control over it anymore because it's patched. 3, 4. So we can grab that again, put that into clock 2, and go ahead and start that from measure 1. So we got 1. And you can see it's just scrolling along. And we're going to wait till it gets to this one here. And you hear how we have a change on that measure. And then we just go back into our straightforward pattern. And And there we have the change again. So that's all there is to it, guys. You just need to get in here and, take the time to program as many different variations in here as you want. And then as you're playing with all your fancy melodics that are changing and moving and whatnot, your drums are going to start having a little bit of life as well. I hope you guys have found this useful, and until next time, thanks for watching. Actually, now that I'm really studying this, guys, I'm finding that it's a little bit odd because it doesn't really want to start back on the first measure here of the global change. I can't seem to figure that out, if there's a way to get it to reset to the very first pattern each time that we reset the clock module. If you know how I can achieve that, please leave me a comment down below in the comments. I'd really appreciate that, and see if we can't figure this out to get it to start on the very first pattern each time, rather than starting on the pattern where it left off.